2014, Bvlgari has been breaking record after record. In the past 5 years, Bvlgari has set no less than 5 world records for thinnest watches. In 2014 they started with the thinnest tourbillon, after that came the thinnest minute repeater and the thinnest automatic watch. In 2018 they introduced the Octo Finissimo tourbillon automatic, which is the thinnest automatic watch and the thinnest tourbillon. This year Bvlgari introduces the Octo Finissimo Chronograph GMT, which is the thinnest chronograph in the world, the thinnest automatic chronograph in the world and the thinnest GMT watch in the world. The brand with the Italian flair casts its expertise in ultra-thin watches in concrete. They seem untouchable in this elegant but very difficult segment in the watch industry. We're going to be talking about this fifth element with Guido Terreni, Managing Director of Bvlgari Watches.
The chronograph is the latest world record in the Octo Finissimo collection. It is meant for a customer which is a globetrotter who travels for pleasure and travels for work, and needed to be accompanied with a timepiece which was expressing modernity but also audacity of the design of the Finissimo. That's why we coupled the chronograph with the GMT function. This is a nice touch, in my opinion, of conjunction of these two important functions to allow a gentleman to have the perfect reading of the time anywhere in the world. It's an extremely complex development because the chronograph is probably the most difficult development that you can think of after a minute repeater. So we built the movement on the experience that we had on the other 4 records we did in the collection. You can admire from the back the peripheral rotor that we already experimented on the 4th world record, the automatic tourbillon. That was the first movement who mounted this peripheral rotor around the movement. This astuce is something that allows us to keep the height of the movement extremely thin, because the chronograph is only 3.3 millimeters. The GMT function is perfectly integrated in the counters, because at 3 o'clock you would have your hometown, and with this push button at 9 o'clock you advance the time of the hour in the time zone you would land with your plane. So it's something extremely easy to use, extremely sober and elegant to wear, a watch that in my opinion is without compromise. No, the construction of the movement started from a white piece of paper. When you do an ultra-thin movement, you must be free to do an integrated movement. That means you're not mounting on a base, a module with an additional function, but you're creating as a whole the whole movement. So having the constraints of being extremely thin on a watch of 42 millimeters, we had set the volume of the movement in which it was a sort of constraint in which to do the development. And constructors were extremely courageous and very innovative in finding the ways of overcoming this constraint of height and of volume that was extremely thin. All the construction of the chronograph, which is actioned and managed by the column wheel with an horizontal clutch in order to be extremely thin. And the peripheral rotor for sure is one of the reasons for which it's so thin, because you're not adding height, thickness to the movement with the traditional rotor. Differently from the automatic, you have sufficient space for the push buttons of the chrono, so it was more simple, if you want, this peripheral rotor than the tourbillon automatic construction. But as I said, it was building on an experience that now we have developed in the last 8 years on ultra-thin movements, and it was extremely satisfying to see that the movement was conceived extremely qualitative from the start. Basically, we didn't re-go and rethink some of the construction of the movement, because from the first test it was already very satisfying. The Finissimo is a collection that was born as an idea in 2011. In 2011, we were looking at a watch. We were looking for a watch that would define what is a masculine watch for Bvlgari. And we immediately thought that the ultra-thin, the slim watches would have been an extremely interesting ingredient to build on. And that's why the whole collection is looking at a masculine elegance that is changing the game of ultra-thin watches. Ultra-thin watches up to the Finissimo are anchored in aesthetic codes of the 50s, of the 60s, in a very formal style. And we wanted exactly the opposite. We wanted to give to a gentleman of today a watch for this generation, for a gentleman which is dynamic and which is able to enjoy an ultra-thin on a daily basis. That's why the use of titanium, that's why the use of a finishing which is sandblasted, monochromatic, a very new look to have on the wrist every day for a gentleman that wants to distinguish itself with taste. Well, first of all, a vision, the idea of what you want as a watch to innovate, and then a lot of courage, because without the guts of going for such developments, you don't achieve it, and without the skills of being able to execute it, you don't achieve it. So it's a mix of innovation, but also a lot of talent in executing the vision.